very much, Dr. Lehmann. Policymakers hate this kind of complexity. It really would have been nice for Washington if you'd oversimplified this and just told us there's one answer, there's one biochar, and the outcomes are all at the upper bounds of possibility. I know there are many questions in the audience. I'm going to start out with one and then invite you to ask your questions. And once we call for questions from you, please identify yourself as you ask your question. You were very clear that the outcomes depend on the feedstock, on the process, on the choice made, the balance of fuel versus biochar production, on the soils used, and ultimately on the crop that you're trying to grow in the soils. And I'm going back to my concern about the rapid implementation of a large-scale biochar program to offset carbon emissions. And thinking about whether we let the market make those choices with all those complexities, and how you think where we'll end up if the market makes those choices. That is, will we have feedstocks from waste or from crops created specifically for biochar? Will we go to degraded lands? What kind of processes will be used? And if you were making a recommendation about how to create regulatory guidance, where would you begin?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a bit of a crystal ball question, but I want to make sure that I don't come across as throwing my hands up and say this is unexplainable uncertainty. I think this is very well explainable variability, and I know this is hard for policymakers, and I sympathize. But apart from the challenge of communicating that, which I think is not that much greater than fertilizer, it is also an opportunity. Actually, admittedly, the variation in different biochars is probably greater than the variation in different composts that one can produce. And with the understanding that we can predict that variability, I believe this is an opportunity, and will ultimately be an opportunity, not a constraint. At this point, it's still a constraint, first in communicating, still in the science to catch up with being able to predict all this, certainly in communicating, but ultimately I hope this will become an opportunity that we can actually tailor the biochars to certain crop and soil needs in a way that is never possible to do with composts. Or mulches, or animal manures, because the animal manures come out of the cow as they come out. We're not doing a lot to it. But if we char by the switch of a dial, we can make very different biochar out of that cow manure that may be tailored to the needs of a producer. So in terms of the large-scale implementation in a framework of a carbon sequestration program and the need for guidance, I believe they should be in the same realm as fertilizer recommendations. So I think at the moment the knowledge system is the important one. And if I take out the crystal ball, it's hard to say what will happen, but I could see the hypothesis being reasonable that because biochar will only generate greater mitigation benefits than, for instance, incineration and full energy generation, if there is a soil benefit, that those applying it to soil will find the best biochar for their needs, and the companies will find the best guidance to make their clients happy. That will be the starting point. If the biochar is no use in soil amendment for a certain client, then it will not be generated.
$100 a ton carbon price with this industry startup. Yeah.
I'll leave the audience to answer that. I think I should be cautious. lashes. We have published technical potentials, and we have come up with values about $20 or $30 where there's a break even, but it's highly system dependent, and I think I should leave it at that.
CO2. No questions? Yes, sir. There's a mic on its way over to you.
Some of the negative use about biochar originated with some of the fossil fuel industries, and some of them regard biochar as competition. And Hampshire College has been one of the leaders of following Phil McKibben's advice in divesting. I'd like to, the UMass has not made this decision yet. I'd like to hear the view of both of you on this approach.
Thank you. An unexpected question. Actually, I have to add a slight nuance to what Hampshire College has done. As I arrived at the college a few years ago, the trustees were reconsidering our investment policy for our admittedly tiny endowment, and decided that it was important for an educational institution that was mission-driven and considered itself morally bound in a variety of ways to also apply those values to how it invested its money. And that, particularly since our product was educated citizens for the long-term future, we should think about the impacts of our investments on the long-term future. As a result, the trustees did not decide to divest anything, but chose a policy to invest in products, processes, services that align with our values and long-term goals. The consequence of that was that when my friend Bill McKibben came to visit us a year ago and asked students to put pressure on the school to divest, I said we couldn't because we didn't hold any fossil fuel stocks because we were affirmatively invested elsewhere. The students said that was good enough for them and have proclaimed divestment, and I'm proud of them for being so engaged. I do think, I know this is wandering a little bit away from our subject, but I do think this question of the opportunity for mission-driven organizations to choose to align how they invest with whatever their values are is an important one going forward. We wouldn't consider making decisions about benefits or pay without acknowledging that our values should have some impact on it. And the Hampshire policy is simply an addition that also applies to investment.
Good morning, Johannes. A lot of this data seem to characterize the chars solely by HTT, the temperature, or perhaps the feedstock. Are you comfortable that really characterizes the char, or does that leave a sort of window of variability as to the char's residuals above and beyond toxicity, pH, and dioxins that creates another source of uncertainty in the study?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, definitely. And I think you referred to the nutrients and carbon classification schemes. Definitely not. And I listed a whole host of proposed and empirically confirmed benefits for some biochars, such as leaching, effects on heavy metal, effect on diseases, that can't be explained by any of these properties that are proposed for the classification system. And so we clearly need more guidance on that, absolutely. Whether feedstock and temperature are sufficient as input parameters, it gets us a long ways, but definitely also not. But I think we need to get away. We need to understand those interactions, but we need to get away from from those frameworks towards a material property framework. And we certainly don't have all the parameters to make a full characterization.
One observation, many of these papers contain insufficient detail to allow another person to replicate the char, to try other conditions. You had little papers written where they took a small retort, pushed a species into a fire at an aging temperature, and ran from there, and that char is essentially impossible to replicate.
Yeah, that's a point very well taken. And we see mostly, at least a year ago I would have said, most results that were published in 2011 and before were done with production under production conditions that are hard to replicate. We're getting better in that, and obviously those papers were written with biochar that was produced in 2005, 6, 7, when a lot of this was not known or the funds were not available to do a good job. And I think that's getting better and better, but it's very well worth making that point very forcefully. Thank you.
Good morning. Dr. Lehmann, in two related fields this year, there were some new findings, I hope, that passed your desk, that related to your wonderful paper on the fraction of pyrolytic carbons in black soils compared in the Midwestern soils. The first was new confirmation about the younger dryas boundary theory of rock carbon spherules and nanodiamond. And I thought that related directly to the new 40 to 50% pyrolytic seed that your paper talked about, given this new evidence for the mass extinction of the megafauna in South America. And the other paper was from the Advanced Life Source in Berkeley, where they identified for the first time potassium catalyst as a cloud nucleation particle aerosol of the carbonaceous aerosols that form 80% of cloud formation. And of course that potassium is generated from a healthy soil fungus. And I thought both of these were very relevant to the evolution of the black soils, and particularly potassium spreading across the continent by the megafauna. And when they died, all of such potassium was in an ecological sense.
Thanks. Yeah, no, they're fascinating results, and I would certainly like the Amazonian example and the distribution of nutrients in the connection to megafauna. So those are interesting, and yeah, you could come up with a whole host of more of those that might help us and inspire some research. No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, Johannes. Obviously we know each other very well. We've been in this biochar space for a number of years. It's been a privilege to work with you and all of the members of this community. And one thing I've realised is we've got less hair and it's greyer. Children have been born, children have grown up, children have gone to school in the time that we've been exploring this space of biochar. As I listened to your presentation this morning, I was really excited to see that many of the gaps and the opportunities in our understanding around biochar are filling out, being filled out. There's much more to know. And the point you were making, that biochar doesn't equal biochar, or that all biochar is not the same, is really important. And as someone who's tried to kind of make a way in biochar that has a more sort of entrepreneurial dimension, one of the challenges that we face is explaining to people who might be interested in biochar that all biochar is not the same. And by the way, that's where a tremendous commercial opportunity exists. But that's not the purpose of my question here. I really want to go back to something that Jonathan said. And it's why I became infused with biochar originally, which is if you believe that there is a need down carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere today to have a carbon drawdown, you realise that buying Toyota Prius is not going to do it. That's going to bring us to net zero if we reduce our emissions today. What we need to do is have strategies to draw down carbon. And there's only a handful of technologies or opportunities which are available to us. And now here's the question. What Jonathan pointed out, I think is a really real risk, is that society and politics is a society of politics of inaction. But at some point, we're going to wake up and say, oh my goodness, we need to draw down carbon from the atmosphere by the gigaton. We need to do it today, tomorrow, next year. And that's going to be a tremendous challenge. And that's where suddenly people are going to look to us. And I've had a little bit of an insight as to what that might look like from my kind of consulting work. There's people who've been in and out of this room trying to understand biochar and what it means. And your point about platforms or systems that bring together feedstock, energy technology, uses for biochar is really important. But the thing that strikes me is that the biochar community and our exploration of those systems has been influenced to date by forces around us which say, well, it's more acceptable to look at this type of system than it is to look at that type of system. And I think that there's a responsibility on us, perhaps as a community, to enable society to understand where those feedstocks exist, what those systems and platforms can look like. And I guess my question here is about policy and positioning biochar. Do you think that going forward, there are ways that we could be supported by those around us who must know that this, I sometimes use because the shit is going to hit the fan somewhere. And at the moment, it seems to me that we haven't necessarily explored the opportunities that may exist when we come to ask the question, how can we draw down carbon into gigaton scale? Do you feel that our opportunities as a biochar community have been limited at the moment by a willingness to explore the platforms and systems which are available to us?
Yeah, thanks, John. Willingness, I'm not sure. Ability, probably, more so. And the question to examine as a scientist, to examine biochar systems at scale, and I don't mean a gigaton, I mean just a commercially viable scale, just at one location for starters, and then a second location, a third location, has been hampered by the lack of the existence of that example. And the scale of that operation is way beyond an academic scale. I cannot go out and raise $20 million just for one unit and have it run and then measure for 5 years. It's just impossible. And you know the challenges of doing research at any meaningful scale at an academic institution. It's virtually suicide. And so we rely on the companies to make that step, and then to allow us to work with us to provide the knowledge base that comes out of their operation. And then, of course, for the nascent industry, there are issues that they don't want to lay open all the economics and all the technical details, and maybe that's not necessary, but also to find the funding framework that allows us to work as an academic institution in a commercial realm is very difficult, apart from the sheer lack of it. So I completely agree, and the research at scale of implementation is hampered. I'm not sure that's the willingness, it's the ability to do it, and I would very much like to do it.
Yeah, we've shared those headaches. I'll take it a step further. Confidentiality is a difficult thing, but what I can see is I have in the past been asked by folks who look at degrading grain forests, for example, and say, here's a huge biological resource degrading through actions which sit outside of biochar. And we think that might be a productive agricultural use for these rainforest situations. And what would happen if we introduced biochar and an ability to produce biochar into this environment where there are trees and rainforest? Maybe it's primary rainforest, maybe it's tertiary rainforest, maybe it's on a one-way trajectory to degraded agricultural land. Maybe it's not. That's just one example of a very large biomass resource, which it seems to me to date has been held out of the discussion because people are too scared to discuss these sensitive systems where there's a fear that biochar is going to do something bad. Maybe there's an opportunity to do something good. And to go back to Jonathan's point, what worries me is suddenly a politician's going to make a crazy decision because they've got something to do in a hurry. And I feel that my question is, have we been holding back from getting into those questions because there's a perception at the moment that such discussions are not acceptable?
I'll have a one-sentence answer and then I'll hand over to Jonathan. Maybe he has an insight into that as well. I agree, but I think we, as a biochar community and individuals among us, and I was among them as well, we made points about technical potential and some of the opportunities and constraints 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. I think that I agree it has died down a little bit to make those discussions, but I think there's a good reason for it because we want to do the due diligence in all kinds of other areas before we revisit that. I'm not sure that there's much more to say at this point that we can improve or refine our models beyond Dominique Wolf's paper from 2010 if we rewrote one of those. But to do these carbon abatement curves that I showed for Africa that the World Bank did, if we could do more of those and discuss that better, that would be very helpful. Not sure that we can do much better than we could 3 years ago until we have at least some penetration in the commercial sector and can point at a few successful business models and know how they turn out.
So the questions are obviously compellingly important, or will soon be compellingly important. I don't have a lot to add, but I would add a question for you all to think about. I assume it is 2016, 2017, and there has been some triggering series of events that lead us to be much more concerned about both reducing emissions and finding ways to reduce existing CO2. And here is this wonderful tool that produces energy, enables us to sequester carbon, and if we do it right, also improve soils on degraded lands. It's too good to be true, yes? Hopefully we'll have done pilot programs that make it very clear it's not too good to be true. It is true. Then think about whether you, if you had the chance to launch the program, would simply create a price for carbon and some rules of the road and say private sector pursue the different opportunities, or whether you would set up a large-scale government-managed program. Because I think that's the choice we're going to face. And as you think about that, think about recent history in which programs have worked well and which have not.
Good morning. This is a question I've asked a number of people in the field, and they tend to tell me that it's a good question, although they don't provide an answer. We talk about the adsorptive capacity of biochar. My question is about desorption, and whether you know of research where heavy metals or toxicants or other substances have been removed using biochar, whether that's a useful or promising technology, and whether you know of such research being done or would recommend.
Thank you. So just to repeat that question, you were asking whether remediation strategies with biochar have worked on a commercial scale or just experimental? The removal is probably with all these technologies very, very difficult, and I'm not sure that it's large scale, because even if you have a good absorption, you'll find a biochar that in a certain soil absorbs a certain heavy metal or PAH to the extent that it is not bioavailable, or the bioavailability is reduced to a satisfactory level. You will probably not be able to remove it.
Well, clearly, if the biochar is distributed in the soil, it's not possible to recover substances selectively. But my question is, are there substances that would be profitable or promising to remove using a biochar-based filter?
So not a soil amendment; it's a filter. No, sorry, I can't help you with that. It's, where I'm aware of remediation projects that have sort of reached semi-commercial scale is with activated carbon and harbor sediments in Europe, and the biochar research points at a much lower efficacy of biochar to do the same thing, but being much less expensive, it could still be a viable economic proposition to doing so. So some of the remediation projects may work, but they can have more. Thank you.
My name is Ron Larson. Previous speakers and Brian Carter and John Gone. Everybody get to know each other better through giving our I want to say three kinds of things. I've been talking to people from Pool Plant. They say they will announce today soil productivity increases much larger. Okay, so anybody in the audience, find somebody from Pool Plant, you're going to see a very big number. And that company also is going to have that big field experiment going next year. So a question for each of you. Johannes, a very early negative about biochar came from David Ward at Portal, Science magazine article about biochar increasing CO2 release. You responded in Science, but it's been a long time since I've heard a discussion on it. And then for Jonathan, we heard about 3 weeks ago that the IPCC for the first time was going to have, for the first time, mentioned sequestration, and in the back of the documentation, biochar appears. Could you describe how big a deal that is? Jonathan.
Yeah, just a quick answer. Thank you for the question, Ron. Priming that David Wardle published in Science in 2008 is a very interesting subject, and Leah Whitman presented a paper yesterday on that. So there's still, and there will be more coming out from various research groups, also ours, on that topic. So it's a very interesting one, and I think we will get a handle on what is happening and be able to manage it at that point.
Thanks for the IPCC question. Are there any of you here who have participated on IPCC panels? So you've had the occasion to witness the kind of scientific discussion that goes on. Scientists at the top of their profession from multiple countries who are reviewing the science that has already taken place. This is not a process of new research. This is a review of existing research to determine what the established existing research shows us and what is new since the previous report. That process goes forward, moves to a larger committee that reviews all those findings, tries to tie it together in the different sections of the report, and then has to go through government policymakers before it's finally issued as a report. At least my experience has been that it is a highly conservative, extremely careful process designed to assure that what is there is a solid finding, and that the addition of information relating to sequestration is very important and reflects not only the science but the extent of demand from policymakers to have some understanding of what the options are beyond reducing emissions at the same time as there's rising concern about the level of interest in geoengineering. Having run a massive experiment on the atmosphere by adding CO2 to it, there seems to be many people who would like to extend the experiment by adding other things without knowing the exact consequences.
My name is Abe Noe-Hayes. I'm here with the Rich Earth Institute in the booth out in the hallway there. My question is about the fertilizer value of biochar and biochar products. Our work is replanting nutrients from human urine and turning that into fertilizer. So far, we've been working with that in just the liquid phase. We collected about 3,000 gallons last year and been using that as a liquid fertilizer on the hay field. We're concerned about ammonia volatilization and nutrient leaching. And I'm aware that a lot of people on the home scale, the small scale, are using biochar combined with human urine to make a fortified biochar. We're interested in extending that to a more formal program, producing that ourselves and testing it. I wonder if you're aware of any research or projects that are working in that area, either with source separated human urine or with any similar materials.
Yeah, it so happens, yes, there are several projects, and hopefully you'll find some individuals, but we can talk about it later as well. I'm involved in a project as well.